Nature usually leaves clues. If you look at a forest after a storm, you see broken branches, shattered trunks, leaves stripped from the canopy. These are the fingerprints of wind. They tell us which way the air was moving and how fast. It makes sense. It follows the rules. But sometimes, nature leaves a riddle. Sometimes the atmosphere produces a force so violent, so focused, and so incomprehensible that it leaves behind artifacts that defy explanation. In the archives of Texas history, buried beneath a century of dust, there is a photograph. It is grainy, sepia-toned, fading around the edges. But if you look closely, if you stare at the center of the image, your brain refuses to accept what it is seeing. It is a bridge, or rather, it was a bridge. The Houston Street Bridge, spanning Post Oak Creek in Sherman, Texas, built by Victorian engineers, built to last forever. Massive beams of solid riveted iron, heavy, cold, indestructible. We aren't talking about aluminum. We aren't talking about modern alloys. We are talking about 1890s iron, the kind of metal that doesn't bend unless you heat it in a forge until it glows white hot. And yet, in this photograph, the massive iron support beams are not broken. They aren't snapped. They aren't sheared off. They are tied in a knot. I want you to visualize that. Take a steel rod in your mind. Now, imagine the force required to grab that rod and twist it like a wet towel, to loop it over itself, to pull it tight. Physics tells us that wind, just air, shouldn't be able to do that. Wind pushes, wind shoves, wind knocks things down. But wind does not tie iron into complex knots. To do that, you don't need a storm. You need a monster. On May 15th, 1896, the people of Sherman, Texas, didn't just see a thunderstorm. They were visited by an anomaly, a black blemish on the history of weather, a vortex that spun so fast and with such unbelievable pressure that it broke the laws of physics. We talk about the Joplin tornado. We talk about Moore, Oklahoma. We talk about Gerald. We have 4K video of those monsters. We have radar data. We have debris signatures. But the most violent wind ever recorded in the history of the state of Texas might not be on YouTube. It happened 130 years ago, and it did things to the human body and to the earth itself that the newspapers of the time refused to print. This is the story of the day the sky turned green. This is the story of the Sherman Cyclone. To understand the horror of May 1896, you have to strip away your modern safety net. Forget your smartphone. Forget the emergency broadcast system. Forget the sirens wailing from the top of the water tower. Imagine it is 1896. Life in Grayson County, North Texas, is hard. It is tangible. It is made of wood, sweat, and soil. Sherman is a booming town, a hub of commerce north of Dallas. It has a population of about 10,000 people. The streets are bustling. Horse-drawn carriages clatter over cobblestones. Ladies in long, heavy Victorian dresses navigate the dusty sidewalks. Men in waistcoats and hats discuss the price of cotton and corn. It is a civilized time, a time of optimism. The Industrial Revolution is humming along. We are building machines. We are taming the West. We feel in control. But in 1896, we are blind. Meteorology is in its infancy. There is no National Weather Service as we know it today. There are no satellites looking down from space, tracking moisture plumes from the Gulf of Mexico. There is no Doppler radar sweeping the horizon, seeing the rotation inside a cloud before it touches the ground. In 1896, the only warning system you had was your eyes. You relied on the telegraph of the sky. You watched the clouds. You watched the birds. You smelled the air. If the cattle got restless, you worried. If the birds stopped singing, you looked up. But on this particular Friday, the telegraph of the sky was sending a confusing message. It is early afternoon, May 15th, and it is hot. Not just warm, it is oppressively, suffocatingly hot. The kind of heat that sticks your shirt to your back the moment you step outside. The air is thick, heavy. It feels liquid. You breathe it in, and it tastes like metal. This is the first clue. The humidity is off the charts. All day long, a massive plume of moisture has been streaming north from the Gulf of Mexico, invisible, silent, loading the atmosphere with raw energy. To the west, out toward the dry deserts of New Mexico and West Texas, A different air mass is moving. Dry, sharp, cool. These two invisible giants are on a collision course, and right in the middle of the impact zone sits the unsuspecting town of Sherman. The locals know something is wrong. Diaries from the day describe a feeling of unease, a heaviness in the chest. One survivor would later write, "It felt as if the world was holding its breath, as if the air itself was waiting for permission to move." But they go about their day. The courts are in session, the markets are open, children are playing in the yards. They have no idea that 40,000 feet above their heads, the atmosphere is building a bomb. And this brings us to a terrifying realization. In the modern world, we have minutes of warning, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes 30. We can grab our kids, we can run to the basement, we have a chance. In 1896, the warning time was 0. If you were in the path, your survival wasn't a matter of skill. It wasn't a matter of preparation. It was purely, solely, a matter of luck. Let's look at the science. Let's look at the invisible mechanics that are clicking into place over North Texas. To get a tornado of this magnitude, to get a monster that can tie iron bridges into knots, you need a very specific recipe. You can't just have a storm. You need a supercell. And to get a supercell, you need what meteorologists call the loaded gun. Imagine the atmosphere as a pressure cooker. On the surface, down where the people are walking, you have that hot, soupy, humid air. It wants to rise. Heat always wants to rise. It's buoyant. It's pushing up against the sky, desperate to release its energy. But above it, sitting at about 10,000 feet, is a layer of hot, dry air. This is called the cap. Think of the cap like a lid on a pot of boiling water. It traps the heat below. It prevents the air from rising. It holds everything down. This sounds like a good thing, right? No storms means a sunny day. But it's actually a trap. Because the sun keeps beating down. The ground keeps heating up. The moisture keeps flowing in. The pressure underneath the cap is building and building and building. The energy isn't dissipating. It's accumulating. It is becoming a bomb. On May 15th, 1896, the cap over Sherman, Texas, was incredibly strong. It held all morning. It held through the early afternoon. It allowed the instability to reach catastrophic levels. The atmosphere was becoming a powder keg. And then, around 4:00 p.m., the trigger was pulled. A dry line, a boundary of separating the moist air from the dry air, punched into Grayson County. This acted like a wedge. It shoved the hot, humid air upward with tremendous force. And suddenly, the cap broke. Imagine the lid blowing off that pressure cooker. Explosive vertical development. That is the technical term. In plain English, the sky exploded. Billions of tons of air rushed upward at speeds of over 100 miles per hour. Not horizontal wind. Vertical wind. An updraft so violent it punched through the troposphere. Within minutes, massive towering cumulonimbus clouds pierced the atmosphere. They went from invisible to 40,000 feet tall, in the blink of an eye. From the ground, the people of Grayson County saw the light change. The sun was blotted out. The bright, hazy afternoon suddenly dimmed into a premature twilight. But it wasn't dark like night. It was bruised. Observers described the clouds as boiling. They weren't just moving across the sky. They were churning, rolling, folding over themselves like kneading dough. And then came the color. If you speak to anyone who has survived a high-end tornado, they will tell you about the color. It's not gray. It's not black. It's green. A sickly, pale, translucent green, like the bottom of a dirty aquarium. This is caused by sunlight filtering through massive amounts of hail suspended high in the storm cloud. It is nature's warning light. It means the storm is dense. It means the storm is violent. The birds went silent. The wind on the ground, which had been blustery, suddenly died. Dead calm. The heat became unbearable. And then, miles to the southwest of Sherman, near a small community called Farmington, the base of the clouds began to rotate, slowly at first, a lazy counterclockwise spin. But physics dictates conservation of angular momentum. As the rotation tightens, it speeds up, like a figure skater pulling in her arms, faster and faster. A wall cloud lowered from the base, a jagged dark pedestal hanging over the unsuspecting farmland. And then, at approximately 4:45 p.m., the finger of death touched the earth. It didn't look like the tornadoes you see in movies. It wasn't a wide, wedge-shaped monster. Not yet. At 4:45 p.m., near the community of Farmington, it was a drill bit. Narrow, condensed, vibrating with intensity. When a tornado is this narrow and this intense, it acts like a scalpel. It doesn't just damage things, it erases them. The first victims didn't hear a freight train. That sound comes later, when the debris field is massive. At this stage, the sound was a high-pitched hiss, a screaming whistle, like a jet engine spooling up right next to your ear. Farmington was a small rural settlement. Farmhouses spaced out by acres of fields. Families sitting down for an early supper. Or out in the barns, tending to the animals. The funnel touched down near the gradient of a creek bed. It moved with terrifying speed. Most tornadoes travel at 30 or 40 miles per hour. This storm was moving at nearly 60. That means if you saw it, you didn't have time to run. You didn't even have time to think. The first home it hit belonged to a family whose name has been lost to the chaotic records of the time. One moment, the house was there. White clapboard, shingled roof, a porch where the children played. The next moment, there was simply a slab. The violence of the Farmington impact was the first clue that this wasn't an F2 or an F3. The house wasn't pushed over. It wasn't blown apart. It was atomized. The wood didn't break into planks. It shattered into splinters. The debris was shot into the air like shrapnel. And the bodies. This is the part of the story where we have to be honest about the brutality of physics. When the human body is exposed to wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, combined with a rapid pressure drop, the trauma is extreme. Survivors in Farmington crawled out of root cellars to find a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Trees were not just uprooted, they were debarked. I want you to pause and think about that. Debarked. Bark is tough. It is designed to protect the tree, to strip the bark off a hardwood oak tree. You need a force that acts like sandblaster. You need high-velocity grit, dirt, pebbles, glass, hitting the tree at hundreds of miles per hour. The trees in Farmington were stripped clean, naked white skeletons standing against the dark green sky. But the storm wasn't done. It was just feeding. It had tasted the earth. And now, it was growing. The tornado stayed on the ground. Usually, tornadoes cycle. They touch down, do some damage, lift up, and dissipate. They are fragile things, easily disrupted by terrain. But this system was perfect. The inflow of warm, moist air was unobstructed. The exhaust of the storm was venting perfectly into the upper atmosphere. It was a self-sustaining engine of destruction. And it was getting wider, as it tore northeast, crossing the open fields toward the town of Howe. It began to change shape. It lost that narrow drill bit appearance. It began to bloat. It grew dark, wrapped in rain, hidden. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of high precipitation supercells in the South. You often can't see the tornado. It's not a distinct funnel against a clear sky. It's a wall of water, a curtain of rain that hides the blender inside. The people of Howe saw a rain shaft approaching. They thought it was just a heavy downpour. They didn't see the rotation until the trees started snapping in half. At 5 p.m., the monster struck Howe. If Farmington was a scalpel, Howe was a sledgehammer. The path of destruction widened to 200 yards, then 300. Farms were wiped clean. Livestock was lifted into the air and thrown quarters of a mile. We have reports of chickens being found, alive, but completely plucked of their feathers. This is a phenomenon that has been debated by scientists for decades. Was it the wind shear? Was it the explosion of the follicles due to pressure change? Whatever the cause, it speaks to a violence that is almost alien. The sound changed here. The high-pitched hiss dropped an octave. It became a roar, a grinding mechanical rumble. One witness in Howe described it as the sound of 1,000,000 stones grinding together. It was the sound of the earth being chewed up. The tornado moved through Howe with impunity. It leveled the Baptist church. It destroyed the schoolhouse. But as it exited Howe, leaving a trail of splinters and weeping survivors in the mud, it did something terrifying. It turned. Vectors matter, trajectories matter. Up until now, the storm had been tracking northeast, a path that would take it through rural farmland, sparing the major population centers. But atmospheric steering currents are fickle. A slight shift in the upper-level winds, a slight nudge from the rear flank downdraft, and the monster pivoted. It shifted its track slightly to the north, directly, perfectly, in line with the city of Sherman, and it was accelerating. It is now 5:10 p.m. In Sherman, the air is still dead calm. The heat is still suffocating. People are starting to look to the southwest. They can see the cloud bank now. It is black as coal, towering miles into the sky. Lightning is flickering almost constantly, a strobe light of electricity inside the clouds. But they can't see the ground. There are hills to the west of Sherman, rolling terrain that blocks the view of the horizon. They don't know that 3 miles away, a grinder is eating the earth. They don't know that the tornado has now intensified into what modern meteorologists would classify as the upper limits of the Fujita scale. It is no longer just wind. It is a cloud of debris. It is carrying dirt, fences, cows, wagons, and the remnants of 2 towns. It is a solid wall of matter moving at highway speeds. On the west hill of Sherman, families are preparing for dinner. At the Houston Street Bridge, the iron beams are cooling in the late afternoon shadow. They are rigid, strong, unaware that in 10 minutes they will be plastic. The telegraph lines are dead. The connection to the outside world is severed. The city is an island, and the tide is coming in. Survivors would later say that just before the impact, the smell changed. The metallic taste vanished, replaced by the smell of pine and sulfur and pulverized dirt. The smell of a forest being shredded, and then the rumble began. Low at first, a vibration in the floorboards, the china rattling in the cabinets, the dogs hiding under the beds. Then, louder, like a train. No, like 10 trains. Louder still, the roar became deafening. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a physical pressure against the eardrums. On the edge of town, a man looked up toward the hill, and he saw it, cresting the ridge, a black boiling wall of death. It wasn't coming for Sherman. It was already here. The loaded gun had fired, the bullet was in the air, and there was nowhere left to run. 5:15 p.m. The clock on the courthouse wall ticks, 1, last, second, and then time stops. For the people of Sherman, the transition from peace to war wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous. One moment, you were standing on your porch watching the clouds. The next moment, the porch is gone. The tornado crested West Hill like an invading army. It didn't descend from the clouds. It seemed to rise from the earth, a solid, churning mountain of black debris. The width was deceptive. It was only 400 yards wide. In the world of tornadoes, that is considered narrow. The El Reno tornado was 2.5 miles wide. But do not let the size fool you. Physics teaches us about energy density. If you take the energy of a nuclear bomb and spread it over a huge city, you get widespread damage. But if you focus that same energy into a pinpoint, into a laser, you get annihilation. The Sherman Cyclone was a laser. It crossed the city limits with a forward speed of 50 miles per hour. It was moving faster than a galloping horse. The first sound wasn't the wind. It was the impact. Crack. Like a gunshot. 1,000 gunshots. The timber of the first homes on West Hill didn't just break, it exploded. The pressure inside the vortex had dropped so low, so fast, that the air inside the houses tried to escape all at once. Walls blew outward, roofs were lifted vertically, intact, before disintegrating in midair. Let's slow down. Let's look at the first 60 seconds of destruction through the eyes of a survivor. William, a local shopkeeper, was near the edge of town. He later recounted the experience to a reporter. He said, "I saw the house across the street. It was the Smith residence, a fine 2-story structure. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the air was filled with a cloud of brown dust, and the house was simply erased. Erased. The tornado moved into the residential grid. It was hungry. It tore through Mulberry Street. It ripped through Pecan Street. And here, we see the true violence of an F5. In a normal tornado, an F3 The roof flies off, the walls collapse. You might survive in a bathtub. You might survive in a closet, but in an F5, the walls don't collapse. They are scoured away. The floorboards are ripped from the joists. The plumbing is pulled out of the ground. The wind speeds at ground level were likely exceeding 300 miles per hour. At 300 miles per hour, air acts like a liquid. It flows. It rushes into every crack, every crevice. If there is a gap under your door, the wind gets in. And once it gets in, it rips the structure apart from the inside out. People were hiding in their cellars, praying, holding their children. Above them, the roar was apocalyptic, screeching, grinding, thumping. The sound of pianos landing on the street, the sound of brick chimneys crashing through floors. And then, the suction. The vortex was so tight, the updraft so violent, that it began to pull things out of the cellars. Mattresses, furniture, and people. We have reports of children being pulled from their mother's arms, not by the wind, but by the vacuum, sucked up into the black throat of the storm, and carried away into the upper atmosphere. The storm cut a scar through the residential district. But its greatest feat, its most baffling, terrifying display of power, was waiting ahead, post Oak Creek and spanning it. The Houston Street Bridge. Let's visualize this structure again. I need you to understand the weight of this object. It was an iron truss bridge, built on stone abutments. The beams were thick, solid iron, the kind of engineering that was meant to hold the weight of steam engines and heavy cargo wagons. It was rigid. It was geometric. It was the embodiment of human order. The tornado approached the creek. Now, usually, when a tornado hits a bridge, it pushes it. It might knock it off the pillars. It might flip it into the water. But the Sherman Cyclone didn't do that. As the core of the vortex passed directly over the creek, something strange happened to the physics of the air, the suction vortices. Inside the main funnel of a large tornado, there are smaller, intense mini-tornadoes. They spin in the opposite direction, or rotate around the main center. They are like buzzsaws inside a blender. These suction vortices can spin at speeds far higher than the main wind. Some theorists believe they can reach nearly 400 miles per hour. One of these buzzsaws grabbed the Houston Street Bridge. It didn't push. It twisted. Imagine holding a ribbon. You hold one end still, and you twist the other end. The ribbon curls. It loops. It knots. Now, imagine doing that. To solid iron. The metal groaned, a sound like the earth screaming. Screech! The rivets popped like gunfire. Bang! 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 The iron heated up from the friction of the bending. In a fraction of a second, the massive beams were curled around each other, wrapped, tied. The bridge wasn't broken, it was sculpted. When the storm passed and the dust settled, people would stare at this bridge for 50 years. Engineers would come from universities to study it. They would run calculations. They would shake their heads. It's not possible, they would say. To deform iron like this, without cracking it, you need heat. You need time. You can't do this in 3 seconds with cold wind. But the wind did it. It left the bridge as a monument, a twisted, impossible knot of metal rising out of the mud. A permanent reminder that our laws of physics are merely suggestions to a monster of this magnitude. The storm roared past the bridge. It was moving east now, toward the cemetery, West Hill Cemetery, the final resting place of Sherman's ancestors. A quiet, sacred plot of land dotted with heavy granite tombstones and ancient oak trees. You would think that the dead are safe. You would think that once you are 6 feet under, the storms of this world can no longer touch you. You would be wrong. The tornado didn't care about sanctity. It didn't care about gravity. It hit the cemetery with the force of a bomb. The heavy granite headstones, some weighing hundreds of pounds, were not just knocked over. They were thrown. Projectiles of stone flying through the air at 200 miles per hour, smashing into trees, smashing into the few houses nearby. But the true horror, the detail that was whispered in hushed tones for a generation, was what happened to the ground itself. The suction. The pressure deficit was so extreme that it scoured the topsoil, it ripped the grass, it ripped the dirt, and in some places, It ripped deep enough to expose the coffins, and in a few rare, horrific instances, it opened them. I want you to sit with that image. The storm didn't just take the living, it displaced the dead. It was a scene from a nightmare, a mixing of the past and the present in a chaotic swirl of mud and wind. And amidst this desecration, another anomaly, the straws. You've heard the myth. A tornado can drive a piece of straw through a telephone pole. It sounds like a tall tale, a country legend. In Sherman, it was a documented fact. After the storm, observers found pieces of fragile, dry wheat straw, driven deep into the hardwood trunks of the oak trees in the cemetery. They weren't bent. They weren't broken. They had penetrated the wood like needles. How? How does a flimsy piece of grass pierce solid wood? It's a matter of inertia. At extreme speeds, the straw is moving so fast that the wood doesn't have time to react. The fibers of the wood don't have time to bend or break. They simply yield. It is a testament to the speed of the event. Violence, faster than the speed of reaction. And then, as quickly as it began, it ended. The roar faded. The freight train moved on. The tornado lifted back into the clouds, dissolving into a shapeless mass of rain and wind as it tracked toward the Red River. And silence returned to Sherman. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The air was still hot. The smell was overpowering. Not just pine and sulfur now, but the smell of natural gas leaking from ruptured lines, the smell of wet plaster, and the smell of blood. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The survivors were in shock. Their brains were trying to process the visual data. Where is my roof? Where is the street? Where is my neighbor's house? The landscape had been flattened. The landmarks were gone. The geography of the neighborhood had been erased. Then, the screaming started. First, a single voice, a cry for help from beneath a pile of lumber. "Mama!" Then another. "Help! Over here! My leg! I can't feel my leg!" A chorus of agony rising from the rubble. The people of Sherman began to crawl out of their holes. They were covered in mud, a thick, black, sticky mud that coated everything. It was in their hair, in their eyes, in their mouths. They looked at each other, and they looked like ghosts, walking zombies covered in the filth of the storm. They began to dig with their bare hands. They tore at the splintered wood. They lifted heavy beams. They ignored their own injuries because they could hear the voices of their children trapped underneath. And then something else happened, something that added a final, surreal layer to the horror. It started to rain, but it wasn't water. From the black sky above, debris began to fall. Not heavy debris. Light debris, papers, receipts, photographs, love letters, clothing. They fluttered down like confetti. A grim parade of personal items. But these items didn't belong to the people of Sherman. A man picked up a piece of paper from the mud. It was a check. He wiped the muck off the signature. It was from a bank in Farmington, 10 miles away. He picked up a photograph, a portrait of a smiling family. He didn't recognize them. They were from Howe. The storm was returning the stolen memories. It was raining the lives of the neighbors they hadn't even known were hit. The sky was weeping the wreckage of a county, and as the sun began to set, casting a blood-red glow over the flattened city, the true scope of the tragedy began to reveal itself. The bodies, 73 confirmed dead. But in 1896, confirmed is a loose term. Many were never found, swept away into the creek, buried under tons of iron and stone, or simply gone. The night was coming. There were no electric lights, no rescue helicopters, no ambulances, just the dark, the mud, and the silence of the dead. The wind had stopped, the roar was gone, but the sky was not done with Texas. In the immediate wake of a violent tornado, the atmosphere is often left in a state of shock. The updraft that powered the monster has sucked millions of tons of material into the upper levels of the troposphere. We aren't just talking about dust. We are talking about the physical matter of 3 towns: wood, plaster, clothing, soil, the water from Post Oak Creek. And now, gravity began to reclaim it. It started as a drizzle, Survivors huddled in the ruins of their homes, wiped their faces. They expected water. What they got was mud. A thick, viscous black slurry began to fall from the heavens. It coated the white shirts of the dead. It turned the gray rubble into a unified, slick black landscape. This phenomenon is known as black rain. It is rare. It only happens after the most extreme firestorms or the most violent tornadoes. It is the atmosphere vomiting up the earth it has just consumed. But the black rain was just the beginning of the fallout. To understand the true power of the Sherman Cyclone, we have to leave the city limits. We have to travel north. 10 miles, 20 miles, 50 miles. In the days following May 15th, farmers in the Oklahoma Territory, miles across the Red River, began finding strange things in their fields. A farmer in Indian Territory, nearly 60 miles away, walked out to check his crops. He saw something fluttering in the high branches of a cottonwood tree. He climbed up. It was a check, a bank draft, canceled and signed, from a hardware store in Sherman, Texas, 60 miles away. Think about the physics of that. To throw a piece of paper 60 miles, you can't just blow on it. If you drop a piece of paper in a gale, it hits the ground in 100 yards. To travel 60 miles, that piece of paper had to be injected into the jet stream. It had to be carried vertically, 5, maybe 6 miles up, into the freezing cold upper atmosphere. It had to float there, suspended in the violent winds of the Supercell's anvil, traveling at highway speeds for an hour, before finally drifting down like a snowflake in a different state. This debris field tells us more about the tornado than any photograph could. It tells us about the energy budget of the storm. It tells us that the updraft wasn't just a vacuum cleaner, it was a cannon. In the mud of Sherman, the survivors didn't know about the debris in Oklahoma. They were focused on the debris falling right in front of them, and some of it was heartbreakingly specific. A woman on East Street found a bonnet, a child's Sunday bonnet. It was muddy, wet, and ruined. She recognized the stitching. It belonged to her niece. Her niece lived on the other side of town. The storm had taken the clothing off a child, carried it across the city, and dropped it at the feet of her aunt. This is the psychological terror of a tornado. It shuffles the deck of reality. It takes the items that define our lives, our photos, our clothes, our documents, and it scrambles them. It forces us to confront the fragility of ownership. In 1896, you didn't have cloud storage. You didn't have digital backups. Your life was recorded on paper, deeds, birth certificates, marriage licenses. In 10 minutes, the bureaucratic history of Grayson County was scattered across 2 states. People spent the next 10 years finding artifacts. In 1906, a decade later, plows were still turning up iron cookware buried 4 feet deep in the soil near Farmington. The earth had swallowed the evidence, and now, under the black rain, the survivors had to decide what to do next. Stay or run. Most of them couldn't run because they were trapped. Nightfall. If you have never experienced a city without electricity, true, total darkness, it is hard to imagine. Sherman had electric lights in 1896. It was a modern city. But the powerhouse was damaged. The lines were down. The gas mains were ruptured and shut off to prevent explosions. The only light came from the flickering lanterns of the rescuers and the occasional flash of distant lightning as the storm system moved away. In this flickering, strobe-lit darkness, the medical nightmare began. There was no 911. There were no ambulances with sirens. The injured had to be carried. Men used doors ripped from houses as makeshift stretchers. They carried the wounded over piles of brick and twisted iron, stumbling in the mud, trying to reach the courthouse or the remaining hotels. The injuries were gruesome. Tornado trauma is unique. In a car crash, you have blunt force trauma. In a war, you have shrapnel. In an F5 tornado, you have both. Plus, impalement. The air had been filled with millions of tiny projectiles. Glass, splinters, gravel, nails. Doctors in Sherman, the few that were available, faced a scene that looked more like the Battle of Gettysburg than a natural disaster. They were operating on dining room tables. They were using whiskey for anesthesia. They were sewing up wounds by candlelight. One doctor reported removing hundreds of splinters from a single patient. The wood had been driven into the skin so deep it had to be cut out. And then, There was the wind shock. Survivors were brought in who had no visible external injuries, no broken bones, no cuts. But they were coughing up blood. They were gasping for air. Their lungs had been damaged by the pressure drop. The rapid expansion of air inside the chest cavity had ruptured the delicate alveoli. They were drowning in their own fluids. This is a quiet way to die. And in the chaos of the night, many of these victims were overlooked. They sat in the corners of the triage centers, pale and silent, until they simply stopped breathing. The sheer volume of the injured overwhelmed the town. The courthouse became a morgue. The jail became a hospital. Every dry floor was covered in bodies, and amidst the blood and the mud, the community began to bond. Strangers held the hands of the dying. Women tore up their own petticoats to make bandages for men they had never met. The racial segregation of 1890s Texas, which was strict and unforgiving, momentarily blurred in the face of the storm. Reports indicate that black and white survivors worked side by side in the initial rescue efforts. The storm didn't care about the color of your skin. It crushed the mansions on the hill just as easily as the shacks in the bottoms. For one night, the hierarchy of man was replaced by the hierarchy of survival. But as the night wore on, and the shock began to wear off, a darker side of human nature began to creep into the ruins. Disaster brings out the best in people. It also brings out the worst. By midnight, the rumors began to spread. Looters. Ghouls! It is a tale as old as time. Wherever there is tragedy, there is opportunity. In the darkness of the stricken city, shadows began to move, not looking for survivors, but looking for safes, looking for silver, looking for jewelry on the bodies of the dead. The sheriff of Grayson County declared martial law. He deputized men on the spot. He gave them a simple order: shoot to kill. This wasn't modern policing. There were no Miranda rights. There was no due process. If you were caught picking through the rubble of a home that wasn't yours, you were shot. We have accounts of standoffs in the streets, armed citizens guarding the wreckage of their businesses with shotguns. One story involves a man found rummaging through the pockets of a corpse near the shattered courthouse. He claimed he was identifying the body. The deputies didn't believe him. He was escorted out of town at gunpoint. He was lucky. Others were not. Rumors persist, though they were never officially recorded in the sanitized history books, of summary executions in the mud. Vigilante justice delivered by lantern light. This adds a layer of grim reality to the disaster. The danger didn't end when the wind stopped. The chaos of the aftermath was just as deadly. The psychological toll of this paranoia was immense. Survivors couldn't sleep. They had to keep one eye open. They had to guard the little they had left. Imagine surviving an F5 tornado, crawling out of the wreckage, grieving your family, and then having to sit up all night with a rifle to protect your ruined home from thieves. It broke people. Many survivors left Sherman within weeks. They couldn't handle the memories. They couldn't handle the feeling of vulnerability. They moved to Dallas. They moved to the coast. They moved anywhere that didn't remind them of the sound of the wind. But for those who stayed, the questions began to mount. The sun rose on Saturday, May the 16th. It revealed a scar across the land that looked like God had dragged his thumb through the clay. And the people looked at the twisted bridge. They looked at the debarked trees. And they asked, what was that? How can wind do that? And this brings us to the investigation, the science, the attempt to categorize a monster that defied categorization. Now, let's talk physics. In 1971, Dr. Ted Fujita introduced the F-scale. It categorized tornadoes from F0 to F5 based on damage. F0, light damage. F1, moderate damage. F2, considerable damage. F3, severe damage. F4, devastating damage. F5, incredible damage. Incredible. That is the scientific term. It means not credible, unbelievable. The Sherman tornado happened 75 years before Fujita created his scale. So, officially, it has no rating. But modern meteorologists who have studied the photographs, who have analyzed the bridge and the ground scouring, are unanimous. This was an F5, and not just a yawn F5, it was a high-end catastrophic F5. Let's look at the evidence. Exhibit A, the debarking. We mentioned this in Act Bind, but let's look closer. To strip bark, you need a wind speed of roughly 200 on spiska, but to scour the hardwood underneath, to make the tree look like it was polished, you need speeds approaching 300 onsi. The duration of the wind matters too. The tornado has to dwell on the object. The Sherman tornado was moving fast, 50-minute rame. This means the wind speeds inside the vortex were so high that they did the work of a slow tornado in a fraction of a second. Exhibit B. The ground scouring. In the fields near Howe, the soil was removed to a depth of several inches. The grass wasn't just pulled up. The roots were gone. The dirt was gone. Only the hard-packed clay subsoil remained. This requires extreme suction near the surface. Exhibit C. The bridge. This is the smoking gun. Civil engineers have tried to model the force required to twist those iron beams. If you hit a beam with a hammer, it dents. If you hit it with a truck, it bends. To twist it, you need torque. You need a force that is applied rotationally. This confirms the presence of multi-vortex structure. The bridge was likely hit by a suction vortex that was spinning at incredible velocity while simultaneously translating forward. The metal was subjected to tension, compression, and torsion, all at the exact same millisecond. The result is a plastic deformation that looks like art. When we compare Sherman to modern monsters, it stands toe-to-toe with the worst. Comparison. Jarrell, Texas. The Jarrell tornado was a dead man walking. It moved slowly. It erased a subdivision. It scoured the ground. Sherman did similar damage, but it was moving fast. This implies that the Sherman tornado might have been stronger than Jarrell in terms of raw wind speed. If Jarrell had moved at 50 mph, it might not have done F5 damage. Sherman moved at 50 and still did F5 damage. Comparison, El Reno. El Reno was wide, 2.6 miles. Sherman was narrow, 400 yards. This makes Sherman more like a drill bit. The energy density was higher per square inch. Comparison, Tri-State tornado. The Tri-State is the deadliest in history. It traveled 219 miles. Sherman only traveled about 30 miles. But in those 30 miles, the intensity was unmatched. So, why is Sherman forgotten? Why isn't it mentioned in the same breath as the Tri-State? Because of timing, and because of what happened 2 weeks later. The Sherman tornado was a prologue. It was the opening act of one of the deadliest severe weather outbreaks in American history. History is often about narrative dominance. The biggest event swallows the smaller ones. On May 27, 1896, just 12 days after Sherman was destroyed, the same weather pattern reloaded. The same clash of cold air and warm Gulf moisture shifted north. It settled over Missouri, and it dropped a massive tornado into the heart of a major metropolis, St. Louis. The St. Louis tornado killed 255 people. It cost millions in damage. It made national headlines. It wiped out entire neighborhoods of a booming industrial city. The newspapers pivoted. The reporters left Texas and got on trains to Missouri. The Great Cyclone of St. Louis became the story of the year, the story of the decade. Sherman, with its 73 dead, became a footnote. It became that other storm. But meteorologically, they are brothers. They were born from the same atmospheric instability. They were part of a family of storms that terrorized the Midwest and the plains in the spring of 1896. This was a time when the climate was throwing a tantrum. If you look at the data, the spring of 1896 was unusually violent. Why? Some theories point to El Niño patterns. Others point to random variability. But the connection remains. Sherman was the warning shot. St. Louis was the war. But for the people of Grayson County, the fact that St. Louis was bigger didn't matter. Their world had ended. Their grief was absolute. And they were left with a town that was half rubble and half ghost. Let's go back to the bridge. For decades after the storm, the Houston Street Bridge remained in the creek. It wasn't immediately scrapped. It sat there, a rusted, twisted skeleton. Children played on it. They dared each other to climb the Devil's Knot. Lovers carved their initials into the bent iron. It became a part of the landscape, a grim tourist attraction. People would come from Dallas on the weekend just to look at it, to touch it, to try to comprehend the force that put it there. It was a memento mori, a reminder of death. In the 1900s, as Sherman rebuilt, As the Victorian era gave way to the modern era, the bridge was eventually removed. The iron was salvaged, melted down, recycled. The metal that had been twisted by the F5 became rebar, or car parts, or nails. Maybe, just maybe, there is a piece of that iron in your house today. Maybe the metal holds the memory of the wind, but even after the bridge was gone, the scars remained. The trees in West Hill Cemetery took years to recover. Some of them, the ones with the straws driven into their trunks, eventually died. The wounds were too deep. The infection set in. They had to be cut down. But if you go to Sherman today, if you walk through the cemetery, you can still see the gaps in the canopy. You can still see the dates on the tombstones. May 15th, 1896. May 15th, 1896. May 15, 1896. Row after row. Whole families. The Smith family, mother, father, 3 children, all with the same date of death. It is a silent census of the disaster, and the town of Sherman itself changed. It rebuilt. It grew, but it lost its innocence. Before 1896, the weather was just weather. After 1896, the weather was a threat. Every time the sky turned green, every time the humidity spiked in May, the elders would look up. They would stop what they were doing, and they would remember the roar. They would remember the bridge. So, what is the legacy of the Sherman Cyclone? It is not just a story about a storm. It is a story about the randomness of existence. You can build your house with the strongest timber. You can build your bridges with the thickest iron. You can pave your streets and build your courthouses and declare yourself civilized. But we live on a planet that is wild. We live at the bottom of an ocean of air. And sometimes, that ocean gets angry. The Sherman tornado teaches us humility. It reminds us that our structures, our lives, are fragile, that physics doesn't care about our plans. 73 people woke up the morning expecting a normal Friday. They had breakfast, they made plans for the weekend, they argued about politics, they worried about money. By sunset, they were gone, erased by a column of wind that didn't hate them, didn't know them, and didn't care. That is the horror, and that is the awe. Today, Post Oak Creek flows quietly under a modern concrete bridge. Cars drive over it at 45 miles per hour. Drivers check their texts. They listen to podcasts. They have no idea what happened in the airspace they are driving through. But the air knows. And if you listen closely, on a hot, humid afternoon in May, when the wind dies down and the birds stop singing, you can almost hear it. The echo of the whistle, the groan of the iron, the day the physics of the world broke, the day the sky fell on Sherman.